And he hands me a VHS tape and he says, if you really want to know how to do it, go watch this. And it just had in black and white letters, it just said, doing it right.
Off-Gassing, a Scuba podcast with host Nick Hogel. Nitrox, mixed gas, decompression diving, technical diving. Most divers are familiar with these words and practices as they are very common in today's world of scuba diving. Years ago, just whispering these words, you could find yourself banished from certain circles within the greater scuba community. Mike Gault is no stranger to these times. A few months back, I had the chance to catch up with my good friend Mike to hear about these challenging times. Difficulties in finding a Nitrox certification, being introduced to a new emerging method of diving called DIR, risks of technical diving, exploring Texas caves, and much more. Please enjoy. Mike, how are you doing this morning?
Doing great, Nick. Doing great. Happy to be here.
Nice. No, I thank you. Thank you very much for coming on, man. I really appreciate it. And so as many of our guests know, you were part of the solo diving roundtable that came out a little bit ago. So that will be, it's just kind of like a follow-up to get to know your story a little bit more. So, and obviously I know your story. We've been friends for quite a while, but to all the listeners out there, it'd be great to kind of hear a little bit of your backstory on the how and why you got into scuba diving. So I wonder if you could tell me about that first experience, what led you into wanting to become certified, how was the course, where was it, all the good details.
Okay, sure. I guess to start that story, my mind goes back to when I was young, years before I took my first scuba course. As a young boy, years I can barely even remember. It was far enough ago. I was really intrigued with water. My grandparents had a lake house on Lake LBJ when I was growing up, and of course in Texas with the heat, summers were filled with water activities in creeks, rivers, lakes, swimming pools, anywhere we could get in the water. I grew up on Jacques Cousteau at a time where the NASA space program was big in the news and got a lot of attention, but I was always preoccupied with Jacques Cousteau and what he was doing. I was fascinated by the fact that there was this whole nother world. It really is another world, and just below us. All the time I'd spend on boats, I'm wondering what the heck is down there. What am I sitting on top of? And one of my favorite diving quotes was from at least it's been attributed to him, was from a cave diver named Parker Turner. And he was asked once, Parker did some really extreme diving, was instrumental in the formation of the WKBP, and was asked once, as the story goes, he was asked once, well, why do you do this? And he said, because they won't let us be astronauts. And so to me, it was interesting to see, there are stores in town where you can buy the equipment, and there are public waters where you can go and you can actually do this. It's not something that only a handful of people on Earth get to experience, to traveling into another world. I was just captured by that. My father worked in the offshore industry, so there was always images of the ocean around the house. He was self-employed, worked out of the house a lot, and so I had back then you had to be 12 years old to learn to dive by the certification agencies, and I was 9 years old and I had a subscription to Skin Diver magazine. I would just look in the images of that thing for years, and it wasn't until I was in college that I actually had the opportunity to finally get into a scuba diving class. I was driving down Anderson Lane in Austin, and one of the things that had kept me out of it for years was money. And I was like a broke, starving college student. I was driving down Anderson Lane, and there was a sign on the marquee outside the store. It said, "Learn to dive, $24.99. And I was like, wow, $24.99 was kind of a lot of money to me back then, but I was like, I could swing that, I can make that happen. And so I got, of course, that class cost me a whole lot more than $24.99, but it did bait me in, and it got me hooked. And I'm actually very critical of the hidden cost model that some use, or the bait and switch model. I'm very critical of that, but I do confess that it did aid me in getting finally getting into scuba diving. And I was ecstatic. Like, I had been anticipating this for more than 10 years. What is the math on that? 15 years or so. Was obsessed with scuba diving, and was finally getting to do it. And I left class, every night they had to claw me out of the swimming pool. Like, I just didn't want to leave. Those just the act of breathing underwater and being in that environment, anywhere, anytime, any place, was enough for me. That's what I really wanted to do. Of course, I dreamed of seeing coral reefs and all kinds of amazing things, but I was also very happy with just being able to swim underwater and not be metaphorically tethered to the surface by a breath hold. Like, through all my childhood, that had been a hindrance to me. I always wanted to stay longer and just never could until now. And did checkout dives. It was February. One of the things that made the class relatively inexpensive was that it was some winter in Texas, and a lot of people didn't want to get in the lake. The lake was the water temperature was in the 50s, and it was cold, but it was clear by lake standards. We had 30-foot visibility, and I know there will be listeners that will cringe at the thought of diving in 30-foot visibility, but I grew up on Lake LBJ, where is before zebra mussels, and the visibility was measured in inches. So to me it was amazing that I could swim around underwater and see fish. It just was an awesome experience.
So you were saying you got kind of roped in with the bait and switch, so you ended up spending more. Did you have to purchase a lot of your own gear, or was it kind of like, okay, you pay for this, and then after you sign up, they start adding all the costs?
So they told me, they said, yeah, we'll provide all your required gear. Years later, I would become a dive instructor, and it would click, the significance, the subtlety, and the significance of what the lady was telling me when she said, we'll provide all of your required gear, except for your personal items, your mask, fins, snorkel, and with scuba fins, you'll need boots. We didn't do full foot fins in Texas diving. And so you'll need to buy that. That'll cost, I think it cost me about $250. So $25 for the class, $250 for your snorkeling package. And I had just, I was an accounting major, and I was working at a bank. I was working full time, going to school part time. So I knew about the dangers of interest and credit cards, and the thought of spiraling, debt spiraling out of control due to interest charges literally frightened me, for my financial security. But I had recently acquired a credit card just to start building credit, and I would put about $25 a month on it and pay it off each month. And I was like, man, I got to do this. And I put that snorkeling package on the credit card, and that was the beginning of the slippery slope of buying dive gear that I couldn't afford. That trend went on for a while. But yeah, as listeners know, it takes more equipment than that. And part of the bait and switch part of it was they were like, well, and this is when dive computers were out there, but most divers weren't diving with a computer yet. They were still diving tables. Your average diver was. They told me, well, we'll provide you the book and the tables for class, and if you decide you want to keep it after class, we'll sell it to you for half price. But that's totally optional. You don't have to do that. Of course, I learned in class, without a computer and tables, like, you can't dive. You got to have it. So it's kind of mandatory. I mean, I guess I could have transcribed it or something. You don't have to buy a logbook. You can just write it down on notebook paper. But of course, that doesn't work. So I'm buying a logbook. They told me, you don't have to pay to go do the open water checkout dives unless you go out on the boat. But the boat's optional. Okay. Well, what they meant by optional was, on the first night of class, I'm sitting in here, and I'm this young adult college student, and I'm looking around the room. It's full of professional looking middle-aged people, and the instructor says, all right, well, we've got the option of going to Windy Point and diving at the park, for free, or we can go out on the boat and you get a discounted rate. It's $35 a day, a diver, to go out on the boat. Let's take a vote. And of course, all these professionals, middle-aged professionals in the class are like, forget the park, like, let's go on the boat. So I got outvoted on that. So it wasn't exactly my option there was, well, you can pay for an upgraded private class and go to the park. So it wasn't really optional. And we got ready to go to open water. And this is the part where years later I would learn when I became an instructor. My first instructor rating was from PADI, and you get the PADI manual out, and there's a list in there of required equipment. And that's written for everybody. The list of minimum required equipment is written for people all over the world and all types of diving environments. So, a wetsuit wasn't specifically required, but in the lake, it was 50 something degrees. So yeah, it was required. So I had to rent my own wetsuit. And so there was a lot of things. And then there was just the total hidden cost. It's kind of dishonest of them. Had to pay a fee to get my C card. It's like, well, no, but that's not for the class. That's for the C card processing. And so I had to pay an additional fee there. And so it was, it just really was one thing after another. But I made it work. I made it happen. And that actually was a factor in me getting into continuing education as well. I didn't have my equipment coming out of class, and none of my friends dove. I didn't have my own equipment except for that basic snorkeling package. But I would still go to the dive shop. I just loved being around it, and I would look around and dream about what equipment I'm going to buy when I save up enough money and whatnot. And then to rent a basic set of gear that I would need to dive back then was probably in the neighborhood of $50 or $60 a day. And was in the dive shop one day, and they were running a special for the advanced open water class. It was $85, equipment included. And so, like I said, I was an accounting major. Not that it's rocket science, but I figured out real quick, I can do more diving. I can get more gear, use if I pay $85 for the advanced class and they provide the equipment than I could just renting the equipment. And I didn't have a dive buddy to go dive with anyway. So I was like, sign me up for the advanced class. I got 3 days of diving for $85. That was the beginning of that slippery slope. Then they said, okay, we've got one here. We've got one on the line. He's going down the continuing education track. Next thing I know, someone's in my ear talking about if I was a dive master, I could dive for free. They would let me use their tanks, and they would fill them. They would do my fills for free. And as long as I was helping out with the class, I got to go out on the boat for free. And I'm like, it sounds economical to become a dive master because I get to do all this diving, and I did like taking the classes too. And they said, okay, but first you got to take this rescue class. And rescue diver is actually, now I appreciate that a lot more than I did back then. When the rescue class is done right, it's a really valuable class. And I've got a personal anecdote about why I feel that way that I could share it in a moment if you like. But it's a really great class. But back then, to me, it was just something that stood between me and the dive master class. So I went out, did rescue. Next thing you know, I'm in a dive master class and doing an internship, going out on the boat. It was good times. All lake diving and a little bit, well, I say all, a little bit of river diving in the San Marcos River mixed in, but pretty much all lake diving for me at that point.
Yeah. What's the anecdote about the rescue? Yeah, I would definitely like to hear that.
Yeah, so that skips ahead to a point where I was a dive instructor, and I'd just done an open water class for one of my best friends and former baseball teammates, and a coworker of his, and some other friends of mine. It was one of the first, I guess, well, no, this was after I'd had my dive shop, so I'd actually done quite a few classes at this point. I just wrapped up a class for these guys, and they wanted to go a rig dive out in the Gulf of Mexico, and they were picking up on all the basic stuff pretty quick, and they were ready to go. We did some good practicing, and they were ready to go out to the rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. And when we went out of Port Isabel, motored north to the rigs outside of there. The rigs were actually that we were diving were actually closer to Port Mansfield, but the boat we went out of Port Isabel. And our plan was, we had a small rig that was expected to be loaded with fish, and it was. Plan was dive that rig and then we were going to do a surface interval, and then we were going to motor over to a larger rig. And we finished our dive. It was an awesome dive, tons of fish. This was back when the red snapper population in Texas was still very strong, and we were up on a surface interval fishing, just slaying the red snapper. The captain was fishing with us, and at one point the captain disappeared, went into the cabin, and we weren't paying much attention to him. We were busy catching fish. And he comes back out a little later. He's like, guys, bring him in. We've got a situation. He intercepted a radio message. There was another boat that was diving. Coincidentally, they were diving the rig that our dive number 2 was going to be at. There was another dive operation that was already diving on that rig, and he had intercepted radio transmissions. The boat on the other rig was trying to raise the Coast Guard because they had a missing diver. Our captain relayed the message between the two and discovered they had a diver missing. Rig diving offshore, most likely reason that would be that somebody got caught in a current and was drifting, got away from the tagline on the boat and was drifting with the current at the surface. And so our captain said, hey, we're going to be going diving at that rig next anyway, and the current happens to be running more or less from that rig to ours. So we're going to start motoring that way, and y'all keep an eye out for this lady, and we'll hopefully, we'll find her en route to the other rig. And we made our way all the way to the other rig and never saw her. And after we arrived at that rig, the Coast Guard arrived shortly after us, the helicopter, and they quickly located her floating at the surface. The boat she had been diving from had dive masters in the water looking for her. So they were tied up to the rig with divers in the water. So the Coast Guard made the decision to bring her onto our boat to effect the rescue. That way they'd have separation from the rig and wouldn't have divers in the water to contend with. And so, long story short, this unfortunate lady ended up on our boat. By this time, I had taken I don't know how many CPR refreshers, every time wondering, am I ever going to have an opportunity or a need to do this? And my question was answered that day. Unfortunately, by the time we found her, it was seemed to be a futile attempt. She ended up getting evacuated off. The CPR was not successful. I think it was past its point, but we tried. Not to take this too somber, but I sometimes think it's important for people to hear that these stories do happen. And the thing that stuck me with it, and why I feel that the rescue class and oxygen administration and CPR and first aid are so important, is through all the chaos that happened there on our boat when we were done, I looked up and the other boat was beside us, near us, and there was a bunch of people out on the deck just all anxiously looking over at our boat. And even though it wasn't successful, I was relieved that we did everything we could do to try to do this. I would have hated to have to look up to face those people on the other boat helplessly, unable to do anything to try to help affect a rescue. I've been diving since 1990, and that's not the only incident. It's the only fatality that I was directly hands-on involved with. But I've had near misses with people I know. A lady who went through that dive master class with me, in Cozumel. She had a medical condition she was unaware of that ended up leading to a really bad DCS hit during our diving there. It's an important class. If and when an event happens, you can be prepared to do, at least what you can to try to help make the situation better and not feel helpless.
Yeah, no, definitely, and that's crazy too, because I definitely agree with the rescue class, because I think when you take that class, you start to approach diving or approach the whole situation. You look at situations differently. So you were saying that you were there with other divers, and I mean, obviously you were pretty far along at that point, but do you think if something like that happened a little bit earlier on in your career, do you think that would have changed the course of your diving to see? Because it is a dangerous sport. I know it could be a very safe sport. I'll tell a lot of people, you make it as dangerous as it can be. You could go out there and you could do some really stupid stuff and make it absolutely dangerous. Or if you follow protocols and have really proper training, it can be a really safe sport. Do you think that would have changed your outlook? Did it change anybody else's outlook? Like, whoa, I'm into this sport, but I don't know if this is something that I want to keep pursuing, being face to face with something like that.
I think it's impossible to know, but I think there is a good chance that if that had happened early in my dive career, it could have affected me. I think if I had not been as passionate and committed to learning diving for as many years as I had been before I did learn, if I was somebody who had stumbled into it, easier later in life or closer to when I received my training, then I think the odds of it affecting, in a significant way would be even greater. As it turns out, in hindsight, it never made me question diving. But I do remember driving the long 6-hour drive back home from Port Isabel to Horseshoe Bay, Texas, where I was living at the time. My friend Brian and I asking ourselves, like, what happens when you go through this? Are we gonna keep diving? We had a conversation about it on that long drive home, and we were like, do we need to do both of us grew up in small town, rural hill country, and familiar with the metaphor, like when you fall off the horse, you get back on right away, because if you don't, then you may never do it again. We were like, do we need to go do a dive tomorrow? Are we going to start we weren't questioning it then, but we were wondering what's going to happen in the coming days. And it turns out our interest and passion for diving didn't falter in the least bit. It just made us more cautious about how we did things. And the other people in the class, fortunately, this is a very closely connected class. I mean, we weren't in training on this trip, but it was a kind of a class graduation thing for some of the divers. But I was very closely connected to them, and I think that close connection to the instructor, probably helped them continue their diving. But I do want to say, Nick, and this is very, very, very important to me to get out, is especially for listeners that may be new to diving or are considering diving, this is not an inherently dangerous activity. Because you made an excellent point. You can make this as dangerous as you want to be. It's like driving a vehicle. Like, you can drive down to the corner store without fear something happens. Something might. It's probably not. And if you drive the way you were taught in driver's ed, you drive safe, it's probably not anything going to happen. And diving's the same way. But if you do stupid stuff when you're diving, it can get really dangerous really quick. I want people to understand when that happens, it's usually a conscious decision by the person to do that. So it's not something that if you're trying to do right and you're working on your skills and you're being responsible, it's a relatively safe activity. I'm big on the rescue and the safety stuff, not because I think something bad's going to happen when I go diving, but it's kind of like protection or insurance for my passion. I've been there. I've done that. It wasn't pretty. I don't like it. And so I want to do things to avoid that. I'm protecting the space because I'm trying to do it because it's fun and I enjoy it. And I take extra precautions when I'm doing this because this is that important to me, that I don't want these external things interfering with my fun and my love for the sport. There's many things I've done in life that were more dangerous than diving. And I've done some really extreme diving. Yeah, I've seen some things happen in diving, but I've seen more things happen outside of diving than I have in diving. So just the law of averages, there's going to be accidents in diving. It's not because diving is inherently dangerous. It's just because accidents happen, and you may be diving when it does. And I like to take more precautions when I'm diving because diving is an important thing to me that I don't want to see ruined by those kind of hardships.
I almost want to kind of make a little joke. I feel more dangerous driving down the 35 during rush hour traffic than I do diving.
Oh, it is. Like, me and my cave diving buddies have talked about that quite a bit. We drive down I-10 at 75 miles an hour in a truck, weighted down, driving 12 or more hours on end. My goal with cave diving safety is the dive should be safer than the drive to get to the dive site. Like, I do believe that drive down I-10 is riskier than the cave dives that we usually do out there. But again, if we did the cave dives differently, then those could become more dangerous than the drive there.
So obviously, at some point, I don't know if this had anything, this whole incident kind of started you down a different path, or maybe you were started before this. Obviously, you're a cave diver. You went down that path of, higher skill level, higher technical level. When did that all start? Was that something that was in the cards kind of from early on, or was it just slowly you're progressing, finding out what's next, what's the next thing I can do? Talk about your progression into that side of diving. Did that happen after you were an instructor, or was it beforehand?
Yeah, technical diving started after I was an instructor. So not to date myself, but when I became a dive instructor, technical diving wasn't really a thing. It was an emerging thing, I'll say. And this was before the internet, and it was very much in the closet. Most of the information that came out through media outlets, you would get your information from dive shops or a magazine. And the dominant magazine at the time was Skin Diver Magazine. And so that outside of your little local community that was not connected through the World Wide Web. Outside of that, Skin Diver was really, or if you took a trip, connecting to other local communities. But Skin Diving Magazine was really your only global connection, if you will, to the diving world. They were actually running articles to squash this thing that was still in the closet, was starting to emerge, which we now know as technical diving. They devoted an entire issue to bashing deep diving. And I remember reading that, and they taught me in my PADI class, 130 feet max recreational depth. You do not go over that for a number of reasons. One of them is your no decompression limits are really low, and we don't do decompression diving. That's dangerous. Don't do it. That's just for commercial divers. You don't do required deco stops. Then another issue, one of my personal favorites, I say that sarcastically, was they devoted an issue to bashing Nitrox. Back then, Nitrox, if it was even known about at all, was considered technical diving. Skin Diver Magazine, they ran an article with all just full of scary things about how you were going to die if you breathe this nitrox stuff. As an example of how extreme this was, the Cayman Water Sports Association, there were rumors, I believe them to be true, they seemed reliable, I never saw them contested. The Cayman Water Sports Association said they would not treat you in their chamber if you got bent while you were diving nitrox. Now, whether they would really stick to their word on that or not in an emergency, I don't know. But the fact that they're even saying that is a sobering thought and speaks to how extreme the anti-technical diving movement was before your average diver even knew that this thing even existed called technical diving. Prior to the Skin Diving article, my father worked in the offshore industry, and I don't remember exactly how, but somehow through his connections, it was in a catalog, or maybe it was on one of his associates' desks or something, but I found this book. It said Nitrox really big on the cover. And I read the little blurb that tells you what the book is about. And it was basically, hey, this is a special breathing gas you can make that you can dive longer. And I'm like, what? And I mail ordered this book, and I read this book, and I literally had never heard of this anywhere before other than this book. And at this point, I'm a dive master at a local dive shop. And I'm like, this sounds like a miracle thing here to me. Like, why isn't everybody doing this? Like, I can put a little more oxygen in here, and I can extend my no decompression limits, or I can shorten my surface intervals. Of course, back then they were still teaching it would also reduce narcosis, but that's called into question now. This just seems like a miracle drug for scuba divers. And so I took this down. I thought I'd stumbled into this great thing, and I took it down to the dive shop, and I showed it to the chief instructor and the store owner. And I was like, man, we need to be doing this. Let's do it. And I got shamed. I nearly got run out of the store. I thought it was, not that being a dive master in Austin was really a career back then, but I thought like I had damaged my reputation as a diver by even broaching this subject with these guys, because they were so concerned, that one of their dive masters had brought this, some of y'all probably heard the phrase before, the devil gas, into our dive shop. And they nearly ran me out of there. And so I went away, and I was pretty young and impressionable. That chief instructor had been my open water instructor. And I kind of tucked tail and ran out of there thinking, oh my gosh, what the heck is this stuff? And then the Skin Diver article comes out, and it's like, oh my gosh. Well, fast forward, I had transferred from college to Texas A&M Corpus Christi, and had moved to Corpus Christi while continuing to work at the bank part-time and go to school part-time. I had this crazy idea to open a dive shop and start a commercial dive company with my father. And one of the commercial divers one day had this magazine called Aquacore. And I'm like, what is that? And it had these weird, interesting imagery on it. And I was just captivated by it. I start thumbing through it. I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is some kind of secret underground publication that's talking about all these people doing these crazy things that Patty told me not to do, my instructor told me not to do, Skin Diver told me not to do. Crazy, crazy stuff. There's people actually doing it, and they're writing about it in print. I'm wondering, where the heck did this guy even get this thing? I thought I probably was getting put on some kind of watch list for even looking at it. The thing that really, really got my attention in that publication was a section, I think it was labeled incident reports. To set the stage, diving went probably in the 80s before I was even getting involved, and then certainly it was the case in 90 when I got involved. There was this misconception about diving that it was daredevil stuff, that it was dangerous stuff. And as we've already talked about, well, it can be, but it can also be a relatively safe activity, low risk if you do it right. But there was a public image to the contrary. And so organizations like Patty and others were doing campaigns. They were putting a lot of effort into educating the public on the true riskiness or safety factor in scuba diving. So there's because they're trying to overcome a false impression, there's a lot of material out there trying to tell you it's not that risky. It's not that risky. The comparison, the quintessential comparison in those days, Patty did a study, and they found that the incidence rates in scuba diving compared it to other activities, and diving was comparable to bowling. Had about the same number of incidents over the period of time in the study as bowling did. And so that says a lot. In my view, it was a little deceptive because you got to look at how did they define an incident. And an incident was defined as I think in loose terms, a trip to the emergency room. And I've already told you about an incident where a lady did not go to an emergency room while scuba diving. And so what it ignores, if you're looking at ER visits, it's not capturing the most extreme incidents in scuba diving. But still, the fact remains that if you can draw a comparison to something as innocuous as bowling, it does say a lot that you could even draw some kind of comparison to that. And as you become a dive professional, they really harp on being positive. And they do this for a good reason, because you get people coming into the classes with some anxiety. And a lot of times it's unfounded anxiety. It's still real. It's a feeling, but it's undeserved because they don't really understand diving yet. And so as an instructor, we help them through that. You don't talk about things like what I just talked about. Even me today, I'm pretty transparent about these things, probably more so than a lot. We've already devoted some time on this podcast to talking about a not so fun event. I'm not shy about talking about those things, but that's not why we dive. We dive for fun, and we want to keep the focus on that. But when you start getting into technical diving, we're taking more risks now. Among the different things that we do to mitigate those risks, what we need to do is we need to take an honest, open, transparent look at things that go wrong so we can analyze that and evaluate it so that we don't repeat those same mistakes. And so, bam, they have a section in this journal that's talking about when things went wrong, when people died, when people nearly died, when people got bent, and they're sharing it and they're putting it out there. This was unlike anything I'd ever seen in diving, that they're putting that out there. So that was my exposure to this technical diving thing. Despite the sobering section on incident reports, I was fascinated at how people were actually getting to go do some of these what I would consider more exciting things in diving, and they're figuring out how to do it and manage the risks. And I was fascinated by that because honestly, as much as I love diving, I was still missing something. I was drawn to it from a sense of adventure. These Cousteau films, and I didn't mention James Bond was a thing, and scuba would show up in Bond movies. It was a very adventurous thing that I was drawn to. And when I got into recreational scuba diving, I realized it's more of a relaxing thing sometimes. It was not this high adventure thing that I thought it was going to be, but these guys and gals looked like they were doing the adventurous stuff. I also felt a little bit vindicated. I was like, look, they're doing that Nitrox thing. See, I knew that was good stuff, and there are people actually doing it. So that started my journey into technical diving, and I did that for many years. You asked about cave diving. Even as a technical diving instructor, I didn't think I would be a cave diver. I was attracted to the team aspect of it. When I got into technical diving, I got this manual, the NSS CDS manual on cavern diving. Even though I didn't expect to do it, I wanted to read about it and learn about it. And it mentioned how divers, when they cavern dive, they dive as a team, and different team members have different responsibilities during the dive, and they work together. That really, really resonated with me. But despite that, I was living in Texas. I realistically didn't see myself being able to go to Florida to do cave diving, even though my technical diving instructor a man I would eventually consider my mentor in technical diving, Jesse Armentrout, was a huge cave diver, and he did it from Texas. He eventually moved east and got closer to the caves, but when he was training me in Texas, he would make frequent trips to Florida to cave dive. And I heard about him talking about it all the time. And he was teaching me things that he learned in cave diving. He was teaching them to me, and I was applying them in an open water setting. But just didn't think I would actually become a cave diver until one day I just found myself in a position where I finally had vacation time from work and had worked myself into a job where I could afford it financially. It's the same sensation I had about learning scuba diving. Sometimes it was painful for me to sit on a boat before I was a scuba diver, to sit on a boat floating at the water surface and have this whole world beneath me. It was painful to have that there and not be able to go see. I wanted to go see for myself what was down there, what was like there. In technical diving, we've learned a lot from cave divers. I spent years technical diving, gathering these lessons and hearing these people talk about what it's like diving in these caves in Florida. And finally, I had an opportunity to go see. I just needed to see. I got to go experience it, see for myself what it's like and experience that. I thought I might be a one and done kind of guy. Maybe I'll go do it, but I don't really have time to do it regularly. But man, when I did it, I was hooked. The thing I loved about it was I was actually, by the time I got into cave diving, I was an instructor trainer with TDI. And here I was, I've taken countless training courses. I taught countless divers how to dive recreationally and how to do decompression diving, nitrox diving, all this stuff. And I was like a new diver again. It was like learning something new all over again. And I had an awesome instructor, Pat Watson, who was helped me through that process. The experience was just really, really awesome. And magically, somehow, I went from a guy who wondered if he would ever be able to dive in a cave to a guy that's traveling from Texas to Florida about every 6 weeks.
That's awesome, man. So obviously, you, like you were saying, you caught the bug. Talk about the path going into cave diving, because you're definitely diving with some pretty prominent people down there.
Yeah, so the path into cave diving to me was really interesting. One of the things about my generation of technical divers, we're in a really unique position because that's when it came out of the closet, which was a great thing, because when it's in the closet, people have to learn more stuff on their own and through lessons, experience. And sometimes those lessons are hard learned. Without it being out in the open, people couldn't as easily transfer knowledge. And so there was a lot of things that we did back then, and there were guys that were doing it long before me that I was learning from. But the list of people at that point was pretty short in the big picture. There's a lot of things we did back then that I wouldn't do today because we just didn't know any better. Helium was not understood very well. There were a lot of misconceptions about it. And so the belief was it was actually less risky to dive a little narked than it was to take on this mystery gas of helium. Of course, we know now that's nonsense. Get on the helium, avoid the narcosis altogether. And I mentioned I was learning from Jess Armentrout. We called Jess the Johnny Appleseed of nitrox or technical diving in Texas, because Jess got in with TDI on the ground level. In fact, I think he wasn't the first TDI instructor, but I think he might have been the first one to go through instructor training with TDI. I think anybody before him crossed over from INTD because the agency, it hadn't even been publicly announced yet when he showed up to what he thought was going to be an INTD instructor class, and Brett Gillum was personally doing the class. When Jess gets out there in Florida, Brett's like, "Hey, we're starting a new agency. Do you want to be a part of this?" And Jess came back both an INTD and a TDI instructor trainer. None of the recreational agencies had a nitrox course yet, because this is not long after the Skin Diver article that told everybody you're going to die if you breathe this stuff. And Jess comes out. His job is to plant these seeds. He's going around Texas helping people understand that that's nonsense. Nitrox is good stuff. There was a time where most of the technical divers in Texas, had to be a large percentage of them, were trained by Jess. And he happened to be on a contract assignment in Corpus Christi when I had my dive shop down there. So just through happenstance, I had the good fortune of getting connected with him and getting his sage advice. And it was funny because it wasn't easy to find an instructor to teach you how to do that. And I was calling around on the short list of instructors in Texas. It was really hard to find somebody. And I called this Jess Armentrout guy who lived like a couple hours away from me, and I got an answering machine. This is back in the days of answering machines. Left a message on the answering machine. I was looking for Nitrox training, and I'm in my dive shop. Caller ID had just come out, and a call came in, and I answer the phone, and I hear this, "So you want to get into Nitrox?" And I'm thinking, who is this? So I'm all paranoid. I thought the Patty police had been called. I was a Patty dive center. I'm like, oh my gosh, what's about to happen here? And I said, yeah, I do. And he's like, all right, well, when do you want to get started? So this is my first time like really having a conversation with a Nitrox instructor, and it's been so hard to find them, and classes are so rare. I'm expecting this is going to be like weeks out or months out. I was like, how do we schedule this? Get on your calendar. And he's like, well, I get off at 5. What are you doing at 5? And so just a few hours later, after getting that call from Jess, I'm sitting in the classroom with a one-on-one to Nitrox, and I'm realizing very quickly that this what was considered a highly technical topic that had just been made into such a huge big deal with a lot of math and a lot of physics and physiology. And he's in there showing me how incredibly simple it really is. For the longest time, he was my only technical instructor. The interesting thing that happened with Jess was in his cave diving, he had stumbled into a group called the Woodville Karst Plane Project, the WKPP, and he was diving with the WKPP. And what that meant was he was bringing back some really great knowledge and methodologies with him from Florida. And so this all happened like midstream in my training progression with Jess. I had no idea. I wasn't a cave diver. Anyway, I had no exposure to this thing called the WKBP. I had no idea what it was. Knew very little about cave diving, but I'm taking a class. At that point, it was an extended range instructor class. Ironically, I'm taking it with my old open water instructor, the chief instructor with the dive shop, who scoffed at the Nitrox that day in the store. Now he's in this class with me as a student under Jess, but he was a cave diver. David, who was an awesome instructor, and I realized later, to be fair to David, he was a physics PhD. He understood this stuff really well, and he was a progressive diver. The reaction from him in the dive shop that day from him was more because he knew what I was heading into. It wasn't because of his personal opinion of Nitrox. He understood how the industry viewed it. Anyway, so we're sitting at the picnic table at Windy Point. Bob Wentz and Jess shows up with his stage bottles rigged differently, his kit's looking different, and he starts showing us some different way of diving. We now know it as Hogarthian or DIR. David already had a lot of the equipment configuration that he needed for this extended range class through his cave diving. He was further along than me on that. So he's got more questions for Jess about why Jess is doing it this way and where's all the gear at. It's very minimalist focused. Things are rigged differently. There's less gear. And David's got a lot of questions, and Jess tells him, if you want to dive with the WKPP, this is how you dive. And those two start connecting on this WKPP thing, and I have no clue what they're even talking about. When we were done that weekend and Jess was about to head back east, he tells me as he's leaving, and my training is still underway, but he's leaving for the moment, and he hands me a VHS tape, and he says, if you really want to know how to do it, go watch this. And it just had in black and white letters, it just said, doing it right. I went home and plugged that thing into the VCR, and it was George Irvine going through the equipment configuration for how they dive on the WKBP. And I was fascinated by it. I'm just looking at it, and this is a guy who is doing really, really big dives, big dives, world record dives. And I'm looking at his gear, and I'm like, where is all the gear? How is this guy doing this with so much less? And so I was fascinated by that, and I was fascinated by the simplicity of it, the streamlining. So that began my journey into DIR diving, and it would eventually lead me years later to actually joining the WKPP myself, which was something I'm really grateful for having had the opportunity to do. Learned a lot in the brief period that I dove with that team. It's difficult diving with them, being from Texas. They're diving in Tallahassee area caves, can't make it out there as frequently. That's when I really started to learn how to dive. It was a lot of change, all because I just so happened to stumble across somebody who was connected with that group that was doing cutting edge things, and which has led now to two training agencies being formed. GUE grew out of the WKPP. And prior to that, Jess and others that were in the WKPP were teaching DIR diving through TDI. And George Irvine himself was even a TDI instructor. That's where it really started getting formalized. Of course, there were specific cave instructors who were teaching this way of diving, but there was no top-down agency saying, do it this way. But within the WKBP, they started doing it through the TDI curriculum. And I was a beneficiary of that because I happened to be connected to an instructor who was doing that. When there was a falling out, political, you might even say personal falling out between the director of the WKBP and the CEO of TDI. So there was a parting of the ways there. And when that happened, GUE was formed. And then now we've had an agency split out of that, UTD. It all originated with this group of divers who was doing extreme cave diving and was really focused on fine-tuning and honing their ways of diving. And I mentioned the equipment because that was the first noticeable thing for how I experienced it, but it really goes far beyond the equipment. It's really about your mindset and your approach to risk management in diving and how you work with your team to execute your dives.
That is a very historic group for sure.
They've even made in recent months, made a milestone connection. The cave goes on. They continue exploring it, learning more and more every time they go out. It's awesome stuff. It doesn't operate on the scale that it once did. I don't know why the team is smaller today. That happened when I wasn't involved with them, but I can observe that technology is facilitating people being able to do more. Like when I was there, it might have been at the peak or near the peak of participation, and it was largely because we're heavily dependent on open circuit diving. They used rebreathers, but they were real selective with when, where, and how they used rebreathers. So it took a lot of people staging a lot of tanks inside these caves, took a lot of people power to get it all back there. Now lights last longer, scooters burn longer and run faster. Rebreather technology is improving. It's much easier to get back to the far reaches of the caves than it once was.
You're now down this path, and that's led you to being a part of projects of your own, and I want to say you have a pretty prominent role in a current project in Texas, correct?
Back around the time I joined the WKBP, kind of that same general time frame, I helped start up a dive team in Texas called the Good Enough Springs Exploration Project. We were exploring a cave in Lake Amistad near Del Rio, Texas. That team has done some amazing things, and around COVID time, activities got stalled. Some of the main players that were part of it prior to that are not diving as much. So coming out of COVID, I've been helping get that program reinvigorated. So the last 3 years or so, we're seeing a good uptick in activity as part of that project. That's where my main focus in diving is right now, is with that project. It's really exciting what's going on there. In fact, we're looking at the weather real closely right now because there was a tropical storm that came through South Texas and northern Mexico, and we're anxious to see what that does to us there because it can affect the lake levels and it can affect the spring flow in Good Enough. That's one of the things about Good Enough Spring is it has extreme flow, unlike any cave I'm aware of that anybody else has ever dove. It's impossible to swim against it. It's impossible to scooter against it. The only way we do it is by using mountain climbing techniques. And we have pull ropes in there that we've secured to the wall with anchors. During the sections of that extreme flow, we have to pull ourselves along that rope. We're always anxiously watching rain events that might increase the flow to the point where we can't dive in there, which has happened once before in 2003 when a tropical storm went over the same area of northern Mexico that this storm went through the last couple of days. So today we're trying to gather up rain data to see how those rain events compare to get an idea if we're going to be able to dive there on our next scheduled trip in a couple of weeks.
Is there a lot of people a part of that project? Do you have a pretty good team going?
We've got about 6 people who are actively diving it right now. It's very remote. We probably have, I'd say, 10 people involved altogether, actively on trips going. It's usually 4 to 6 guys at a time. We're limited by boat capacity because it's a long boat ride. It's a really remote location on the Mexican border. You have to get there by boat. So there's only so much space on the boat for divers and gear. So it's a pretty small team. We've got another boat that we consider in the fleet that's getting some repair work done. When we have that, we might be able to take more people. But yeah, we had a good solid group. Some of them are new to cave diving. And so we're just kind of building up the team capabilities with some of the new guys and getting some of our infrastructure reestablished inside the cave. It takes time because it's such a long trip. We can only get out there so often. And then it's a deep dive. We actually consider it shallow right now. The entrance to the cave is at 100 feet, but we consider that shallow because the lake level is about 50 feet low right now. If the lake was full, the entrance to the cave would be more like 150 feet deep, and it goes down a very steep angle. You can be a couple hundred feet deep in that cave and only be a couple hundred feet from the entrance.
What's the how far have you guys explored into it?
The penetration distance, not sure off the top of my head. It's 500 feet-ish, which isn't very far at all. But the end of the line on that dive was 515 feet deep. And so the end of the line right now, I'd have to go look at the records because of fluctuating lake levels. The end of the line might be at 500 feet now. The lake was not full when Chuck Noe went to 515. So like if the lake fills up, the end of the line will be even deeper than 515. It's interesting with the angle that it goes down. The rule of thumb is that the depth approximates the penetration distance. So that's why I'm guessing about 500 feet deep is because, about 500 foot penetration distance, because there's kind of a correlation. That's just the way the configuration works out. At some point, that rule of thumb may break or start to vary more. There's a major restriction at around 200 feet, a little shallower now, that's very, very difficult to get through because it's a tight restriction and there is extreme flow there. It's not easy to get through that restriction. There are not many divers who have even been through that restriction. There have been 3 big pushes beyond it. One was when Chuck made it through. We spent years trying to get through that restriction. If there were more caves to dive in Texas, we probably would have moved on and said, this one isn't worth the trouble. But it's the only public one we've got. So we put extra effort into it. Spent years trying to get through that and finally did. And that's a whole story. You could do a whole episode on that. But when Chuck got through, he did a follow-up dive, did it down to like 275, 285 feet or so, just to see, is this thing still going? He came back and reported that it did. We did what the team considers the first really big push dive beyond that. And that's when Chuck and myself went to 393 feet. And it was still going down at a pretty good angle. Then while I was on a break from the team, my wife had a serious medical condition that prevented me from diving for a little while. And during that window of time is when Chuck extended the line down to 515 feet. The thing a lot of people seem to want to know is, are we going to extend the line? And maybe we will, maybe we won't. It's difficult on open circuit at that depth, as particularly when it's that hard to get down there with equipment. It's hard to get a lot of tanks and a lot of divers down there to do setups for a dive that deep. The interesting thing I really got an appreciation for when I did the 393-foot dive was the gas management on that when you're on open circuit. You know, when we generally think of scuba tanks in terms of how many minutes they will last us at a certain depth. When you start getting down there, you start getting to a point where you're thinking about not how many minutes am I going to get out of this tank, how many breaths am I going to get out of this tank. When you're carrying stage bottles and you're on side mount, we have side mount to get through that restriction. So we're swapping out tanks. We're swapping out side mount tanks. We're swapping out stage tanks, and diminishing returns starts to set in at some point, right? Because even if you're efficient in swapping out tanks, you're going to consume some of your breaths doing that, right? And so you get to the point where you're asking yourself, why am I even bothering swapping these tanks out? Because by the time I take my reserve gas out of this tank I'm switching to, and then I breathe from the part I'm planning to use, by the time I get the thing on and can continue on with my dive, like, what was the point? It's almost time to drop the cylinder again. And that's kind of where we're at. Chuck reported when he did his dive that he could see the needle on his pressure gauge move as he was breathing. And so that's just, to me, that's getting too deep for these cylinders. If you look at divers who do that deep stuff on open circuit, they've got these crazy manifolded situations with all these tanks on their back that I'm just not going to do. I'm not going to plumb in several tanks on my back. And so we start thinking about rebreathers, but then they've got limitations that deep, and they've got limitations in the flow. So like, how do you manage getting through the heavy flow section? Do you do that on open circuit and switch to a rebreather? These are all things that we're exploring and thinking about. Maybe one day it'll get to the point where we want to try something to push. But right now, we're experimenting with some things. We're looking at getting a habitat down there. The deco's getting long enough that I feel like we need to get up out of the water for comfort and for managing oxygen toxicity risk. We're looking at how to get that anchored down there. Who knows if we'll ever go deeper, but it's fun making preparations, and we're helping scientists. Our next trip out there is going to be to retrieve data sondes, our own data sondes that our team has invested in, as well as some research that the National Park Service is involved with, and an outfit, Southwest Research Institute. We're pulling data on for them. And so we're still learning things about the cave. This rain event that just happened, probably still dropping water now, but it's been happening the last couple of days. This is going to be an interesting data point that we're going to have. Still lots to learn about this cave, and just very glad that we have it this close to home. A lot of people won't go out there with us because it's a 4 to 6 hour drive for them. For somebody who's been driving 12 and 14 to get to Florida, 4 or 5 hours sounds pretty short to me.
We'll have to have you back on to hear more about the project, and hopefully we can get, I know we were kind of chatting a little bit about maybe doing a Texas roundtable, get some folks. It'd be kind of cool to hear a little bit about that. Yeah, man, no, I really, really appreciate you coming on to the podcast.
Thanks for giving me an opportunity to talk about diving, Nick. And any opportunity I get to talk about diving is a good opportunity for me. So I appreciate you having me on, and I hope your listeners enjoy listening to at least some of what I had to say.
Off-gassing, a scuba podcast.